Raphael slid his ticket through the turnstile with automatic movements, the weight of exhaustion pressing heavily on his shoulders. It was late, and all he wanted was to get home, forget the grueling day, and shake off the emptiness that seemed to cling to him. When the train arrived at the platform, he rushed inside, hearing the metallic thud of the doors closing behind him. The carriage was nearly empty. Just a couple dozing in the back and a man in a suit typing something on his phone. Sitting near the window, Raphael stared outside, but all he saw were blurs of lights and dark tunnels. His mind drifted to thoughts he'd rather avoid, yet they persisted like an indelible stain. A bad decision here, a lost relationship there. He sighed, closing his eyes and leaning his head against the seat. The electronic voice announced the next station, but Raphael paid no attention. He didn't have the energy to check the name. Before he realized it, the train had stopped, and he got up instinctively. It was his routine to disembark without thinking, following the same schedules and routes. He stepped off the train, and the doors shut behind him with a click that echoed in the emptiness. Raphael looked around, frowning. The station was deserted. Not a soul, not a sound. Fluorescent lights flickered at irregular intervals, casting unsettling shadows across the grimy, graffiti-covered walls. "What the hell is this place?" he muttered, his voice sounding strange against the oppressive silence. He walked toward the station's name sign, but it was illegible, smeared with rust and paint. The train pulled away, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Raphael turned to watch the rear lights fade into the tracks, a growing unease blooming in his chest. He glanced around again. No ticket booth, no station workers. He was alone. Raphael adjusted his coat, an unexpected chill running down his spine. The air felt colder than it should, almost frigid, as if something unseen was draining the life from the place. He started walking along the platform, trying to find an exit or at least a sign that someone else was there. His footsteps echoed on the concrete floor, louder than they should have been in the crushing silence. With each step, Raphael felt as if the space around him was closing in, the corridors narrowing, the shadows thickening. A sound interrupted his thoughts, footsteps. He froze immediately, his body tensing. The sound was faint but distinct, coming from behind him. Turning, he stared into the tunnel where the train had disappeared. Nothing, just the dark void stretching as far as his eyes could see. "Hello? Is someone there?" he called out, his voice echoing, mocking his attempt to stay composed. No answer. Taking a deep breath, Raphael shook his head and resumed walking, convincing himself it was his imagination. But the footsteps returned. This time they were closer. He stopped again, his heartbeat quickening, and spun around sharply. There was something. Out of the corner of his eye, a shadow seemed to glide along the opposite wall. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but Raphael was certain it wasn't a trick of the light. He tried to move toward it, but as he stepped forward, the shadow vanished as if it had never been there. His breathing grew heavier. He scanned the platform, desperate for anything that made sense. Then he heard it. "Raphael?" The voice was low, a muffled whisper, yet clear enough to make him freeze in place. It was impossible to ignore. Someone had said his name. His eyes darted around the platform, but there was no one, just him and the suffocating emptiness. Slowly, he turned to look down the corridor behind him. That's when he felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Swallowing hard, Raphael decided to walk to one of the station's benches. His legs trembled, but he needed to sit and think. Maybe it was just exhaustion playing tricks on him. Maybe. He sat down, closing his eyes for a moment. A metallic sound reverberated, like something falling onto the tracks. Startled, he opened his eyes, and that's when he saw it. A figure stood at the far end of the platform. It was motionless, its outline obscured by the irregular flickering of the lights. He couldn't make out any details, but it was there, staring directly at him. Raphael was paralyzed. Raphael could barely breathe, his eyes locked on the figure at the far end of the platform. The light flickered relentlessly, and with every fraction of a second the darkness claimed the space. He was certain the shadow was inching closer. He blinked repeatedly, trying to confirm if what he saw was real, but the silhouette remained motionless. "Hey, who's there?" he shouted, his voice echoing through the empty station. No response. The silence now felt heavier, almost tangible, pressing against his ears. The figure vanished with the next flicker of light. Raphael swallowed hard, his heart pounding like a drum. For a brief moment, he considered jumping onto the tracks and following the tunnel in search of an exit. But something deep within him stopped him, a visceral sense that he should stay far away from the darkness. "This is just exhaustion," he muttered to himself, trying to rationalize. He stood up from the bench, his legs trembling, and began walking toward the stairs leading to the station's upper level. With every step, the echoes of his shoes seemed to multiply, creating an almost ghostly effect. When he reached the top of the stairs, he stopped abruptly. In the reflection of a grimy display window, he saw a familiar face. It was Clara. His heart froze. She was there standing behind him, or so it seemed. The reflection was blurry, but he would recognize her anywhere. Her eyes were fixed, vacant, almost accusatory. Raphael spun around quickly to face her, but there was no one there. A knot tightened in his throat. He started to descend the stairs again, but the echoes of his footsteps became disordered, as if someone else was climbing toward him. Stepping back onto the platform, he was greeted by a muffled sound, distant laughter. Raphael spun around, his eyes darting in all directions, searching for the source, but the station was still empty. The feeling of being watched returned with full force, and goosebumps prickled his skin with every passing second. That's when he saw another face, Marcos, an old friend he hadn't seen in years, standing beside the bench where Raphael had been sitting. "No, this isn't real," he whispered. Marcos didn't speak, but his gaze was piercing, filled with sorrow. Memories flooded Raphael like a cold wave. Marcus' plea for help years ago, when everything in his life was falling apart. And Raphael, too consumed with his own problems, had ignored him. Now there he was, or something wearing his form, staring at him. Despair took hold. Raphael ran toward a door he believed led to an exit, but it was locked. He tried another, with the same result. He looked back, and now there was another figure. It was Helena, his ex-wife. Raphael stumbled backward, pressing himself against the locked door. The shadows taking the forms of Clara, Marcos, and Helena seemed to surround him, and he realized there was no escape. More than that, he felt they weren't there by chance. Each face, each gaze, dredged up something he had tried to bury for years. These were his ghosts, and they were here to collect on something he still didn't understand. The station seemed to fold in on itself, trapping him in an endless cycle. Raphael tried running down the tracks again, but when he reached the end of the tunnel, he found himself back on the same platform. He was trapped. Raphael fell to his knees on the cold platform floor, his breath labored and his chest tight with anguish. The figures of Clara, Marcos, and Helena stood before him now, their presence as chilling as the wind seeping through the cracks of the station. He didn't know how long he had been there, but the weight of exhaustion, both physical and emotional, was crushing him. Clara was the first to step forward. Her eyes, hollow and accusatory, seemed to pierce straight through Raphael's soul. He tried to look away, but he couldn't. "I gave you everything," she said, her voice low and heavy with resentment. "And you destroyed it all, Raphael." He swallowed hard, the pain in her words cutting as if they were his own. He wanted to explain, to defend himself, but the words failed him before they could leave his mouth. Each of the apparitions brought a fresh accusation, an open wound he knew would never fully heal. Marcos stepped forward next, his face etched with anger and sorrow. "You left me alone, Raphael. You drifted away and never tried to help me. I needed you and you abandoned me." Raphael shut his eyes, the weight of Marcus' words pressing down like a physical force. He remembered the day he had turned his back on his friend in selfish indifference. Marcus' plea for help, the countless missed calls, the days Raphael could have made a difference, but chose to remain insulated in the comfort of his own world. Helena lingered farther back, her gaze heavy with sadness and quiet pain. "All I wanted was to be loved," she said. "But you never gave me that, Raphael. You were always lost inside yourself." A sharp ache shot through his chest. Helena was right. She had loved him unconditionally, always giving her best, and he had failed her. He had been so consumed by his own struggles and insecurities that he neglected what truly mattered. The station twisted around him, the shadows on the walls stretching and writhing as though the place were alive, feeding on Raphael's torment. He realized now that this wasn't real, that this station didn't physically exist. It was a construct of his mind, a reflection of his guilt and regret. He wasn't trapped because the place was inaccessible. He was trapped because he had never faced the demons that haunted him. The figures began to fade slowly, but Raphael knew he wasn't free yet. He stood, his legs weak, and walked toward the center of the platform. The sound of his footsteps was the only sound left, reverberating in the empty station. When he looked into the smudged windows, he saw a distorted version of himself. What stared back at him was a man consumed by guilt, with hollow eyes and trembling hands. The reflection glared at him with disapproval, and Raphael felt a crushing weight in his chest. This shadowy version of himself was the worst ghost of all, a mirror of everything he had done, all he had lost and neglected. The dark version of himself stepped forward, advancing slowly. But instead of retreating, Raphael did the one thing he feared most. He embraced it. "I've failed," he said, his voice trembling. "I know I've failed. I didn't know how to face it, but I know I need to change." The shadow dissolved in his arms, and the suffocating pressure in his chest began to lift. Raphael felt a weight leave his shoulders, a sense of release he had never thought possible. But even so, he knew he wasn't truly free. The station still loomed around him, watching, but there was something different now, perhaps an acceptance, or a quiet promise of change. He turned toward the station doors, and for the first time they opened. Raphael took a deep breath, his hesitant footsteps echoing across the now eerily quiet platform. The station doors stood open, as though the place itself had granted him passage. He crossed the threshold cautiously, the air outside feeling fresher, but still laced with an unsettling presence. Something invisible lingered, an oppressive shadow that refused to let him go. As he walked, he stopped abruptly. Standing before him was the final figure, a distorted version of himself, a dark reflection that was undeniably his own. Raphael immediately recognized the gaze, a mix of self-criticism and disdain that had haunted him for years. But this time, the figure wasn't confined to the station's reflective glass. It was here, solid and imposing, staring directly at him. "You can't get rid of me," the dark figure said, its voice deep and cold, like a distorted echo of Raphael's own words. Raphael froze, the weight of this ultimate confrontation bearing down on him. For so long, he had believed that his mistakes, guilt, and failures were an inseparable part of who he was. But now, standing face to face with this manifestation of fear and regret, something inside him stirred. "You're what I've always been," Raphael replied, his voice unsteady but firm. "But not what I want to be." The shadow laughed, a harsh, cruel sound that reverberated through the empty station. "You think you can change? You think you can leave everything you've done behind?" Raphael closed his eyes for a moment, remembering the faces of Clara, Marcos, and Helena. They had brought him pain, yes, but also truth. They weren't just ghosts, they were lessons. They reminded him that while he had failed, change was still possible. He opened his eyes, staring directly at the shadow. This time, there was no hesitation. "I'm not you anymore," Raphael said, his voice filled with resolve. With those words, something extraordinary happened. The environment around him began to shift. The shadows that had once dominated the station receded, like fog dissolving under the warmth of the morning sun. The walls lit up with a soft golden glow, and the trembling in his legs gave way to newfound strength. The shadow attempted to advance, its eyes now blazing with fury, but its form began to fade. It retreated, dissolving into nothingness, like smoke blown away by the wind. Raphael felt the weight on his shoulders lift. For the first time in years, his chest felt light, his breathing unburdened. He didn't look back as he walked toward the exit, knowing deep down that the battle was over. He had faced his demons, confronted what once seemed insurmountable, and now he was ready to move forward. As he crossed the station's threshold, the outside world welcomed him with the light of dawn. Raphael paused, glancing briefly behind him. There was nothing left, only the empty platform, now serene and bathed in light. He knew the scars would remain, reminders of his failures and regrets. But they would no longer define him. His journey was only beginning, and this time, he carried with him not guilt, but the strength to rewrite his story. He allowed himself a faint smile and took his first step into the open air, feeling the warmth of daylight on his skin. He was free. Raphael walked along the tracks, the sound of his steps softened by the gentle dawn breeze. The station behind him now felt like a distant memory, as if everything he had endured there was a manifestation of his deepest fears and anxieties. The sky above was painted in soft hues of blue, signaling the arrival of a new day. While the weight of the night had lifted, the morning light didn't erase the sense that something profound had shifted within him. He didn't look back as he walked. The deserted station, with its shadows and figures, was now a part of his past. It no longer held power over him, and he knew he wouldn't need to return. He was finally free from the burdens that had haunted him for so long. Yet there was still something he needed to do. He stopped at the edge of a quiet street, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Deep down he understood that the confrontation wasn't entirely over. The weight of regret wouldn't vanish overnight, but he was beginning to realize that true freedom wasn't about denying the past. It was about accepting it. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Pulling it out, he saw a message from Clara. "I've been thinking about you. How are you?" Raphael stood still, staring at the screen, his mind racing as he considered what to say. Whatever it was, he knew it had to come from a more honest place now. He took a deep breath and began typing. The pain that had once paralyzed him now transformed into clarity. "I'm trying to make things right now. I know I messed up, and I won't hide from it anymore." As he hit send, a sense of relief washed over him. He didn't know what the future held, but he understood that by finally facing his ghosts, he was opening the door to a new chapter. Raphael slipped the phone back into his pocket and looked at the horizon again. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he no longer feared what lay ahead. The past, with its shadows and regrets, no longer controlled him. He smiled, the scars of his experiences still present, but now they were marks of resilience rather than wounds. The deserted station no longer existed, and Raphael was finally free to move forward.